Hello everyone, this is Starry Ari's ASMR. I am Ari, and today I would like to do a little bit of a book review / book haul based on some of the books that I've recently read these last couple of months and a few of the books that I have purchased in these last few months. And I posted a poll on my community page and kind of asked what types of videos would you be interested in this month, and this one was the winner. I will probably do the other ones also at some point, but this one I wanted to make sure and do because it seemed like quite a few folks were interested in it. I also have a little bit of a newer setup that's probably going to change, but I mentioned in my life update video that I have a new job, and that new job required some additional equipment, and so I needed a little bit more space. So my husband and I swapped our office rooms because the one that he was using is a little bit bigger. And so this situation will probably shift as I'm kind of figuring out exactly what I want to do. This is a very wobbly tray basically, and so I don't think I would want to do this long term. But for now, it is what I'm working with. I think what I'm going to start with is my book review. And now these are not all of the books that I've read in the last few months, but I picked out 3 that I wanted to talk about. I would say at least 2 of these are pretty heavy topics. I usually like to kind of stay away from stressful topics as much as possible. Obviously for you guys, because this is meant to be a relaxation channel, but also for me because this is a relaxing hobby for me to do as well. And in my daily life, I'm constantly inundated with the stressors of the world and everything always going on all the time. So, I usually like to kind of refrain from talking about too many stressful topics just for those reasons. But some of these books, I took notes while I was reading them because I found them so interesting. And one of them I had, I think, almost 8 pages of notes, typed out notes. And so I went through them and kind of figured out what are my main takeaways and my main thoughts about that book in particular. So I will go ahead and start with the book review first, and then I'll have a timestamp for kind of a book haul / books that I'm, looking forward to reading next. So the first book that I want to talk about is Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World. Now, this book I absolutely loved, and this is the one that I had over 7 pages of typed notes on. I'm not typically somebody that takes notes while I'm reading casual books, but this one I thought was so interesting as I was going along, and there were points being made that I wanted to write down. And it felt like a lot of these points that Carl Sagan makes in this book really spoke to kind of something in me right now, especially in the age of social media and misinformation and anti-intellectualism. And I think that this kind of gave me a newer framework for kind of dealing with some of those stressors with empathy and compassion. And he wrote this book. So if you don't know, Carl Sagan was a famous science communicator. And he wrote this book in the 90s. I believe it was 95. And I feel like this has only grown in relevance since being published. And I had so many thoughts and quotes that I pulled from this. And it is generally about how scientific thinking and skepticism, not cynicism, because there is a difference, can kind of help us make sense of misinformation, fallacious arguments, and to use, I think, his own frequent word, baloney. He framed a lot of his points around kind of using like a baloney detection toolkit. And so throughout the book, there are these like tips and ways that we as a general public can kind of think about things, not even just science, but just the world around us in maybe some better ways, and ways that we can kind of protect ourselves from logical fallacies and how to combat them when they're around us. And I think the through line for this book for me was kind of that belief that critical thinking, education, and I think science literacy are kind of all essential tools for, I think he really kind of frames it around like personal freedom, but also like a just, equitable society. And he really makes a lot of these points in a way that kind of makes room for empathy, for like human vulnerability, because I think a lot of people's experiences with scientists that, you know, maybe would be trying to like debunk a demon haunted world would be kind of skepticism leaning into cynicism, where it's just blatantly negative and there's never really any room for like a human experience in it. He kind of framed this in a really important way for me that created this balance of like skepticism and empathy. But I really enjoyed reading this. I desperately want my husband to read this so that we can talk about it, because he really appreciates Carl Sagan as the wonderful science communicator that he was. We both love Contact, the science fiction book that he wrote. It's just like a phenomenal classic. And his writing style in this was really interesting. I think that he was a great writer at being able to get his points across. And he co-wrote this with his wife. I think Andrian was her name. I don't think it has it on here, but there are sections marked that they like co-wrote. It has her name on them. And I think it was just a really helpful framework for me, kind of looking at where we're heading right now. And I feel like I need everybody to read this book. And he does talk a lot about really common, like, you know, supernatural situations and his perspective on maybe what could be going on. A really common one that he comes back to a lot is like UFO narratives. And he talks about kind of some of the history around that, and also the history of humans kind of having really similar stories, but framing it as demons or fairies, you know. And he does a really great job of kind of putting this newer phenomenon into a historical perspective. One of the quotes that really stuck out with me from this was that there are wonders enough out there without our inventing any. That kind of means like the universe is amazing. It is phenomenally complex. And we know the tiniest fraction of it, you know? And that's kind of his perspective. And it's not like this entire book is like trying to like debunk religion or anything like that. But he does kind of bring up a lot of things like historically that humans have thought, about different supernatural phenomena that we then just kind of learned more about through science. And I think he does that pretty well and really points out, our human ability to create things with our brains. We are so good at being able to have our brains fill in information because ultimately that is how we have survived. This book emphasizes something that in my household we talk a lot about because my husband is a teacher. He teaches physics and astronomy and math. And we talk often about students really needing to be taught critical thinking skills. So not just teaching people what to think, but how to think and how to learn. And there's a chapter at the end of the book that really rang true for me right now. And it was titled Real Patriots Ask Questions. He discusses kind of the historical precedents of powerful authority figures, whether that be, politicians or religious leaders or community leaders, whatever it be, not wanting the general public or population to question things as much. And sometimes there have been, instances where people maybe want the authority of science and being able to say, well, this is what the research shows or whatever, but they don't actually adhere to the rigor of the scientific method, and they're not up for really any true debate about methods or things like that. There were some topics in here that, he points out some reasons why the public, specifically looking from an American lens, kind of devalue science or cannot access science as a tool. But I feel like he doesn't really go far enough to discuss some of those barriers and why that might be happening at a wide scale. But I think that's also just a sociologist in me that's really interested in diving into all of those sociological implications. And I think one thing that he says kind of in that vein is, the United States might be the best entertained nation, but a steep price is being paid out. And, thinking about how do we change that culture then if people are overworked, if they're tired, if they are chronically online and exposed to more problems going on in the world than any other human at any point in history has ever seen or known about before. How do we address that? And I also think those are kind of more modern questions than what he was addressing in the 90s. But he really makes a good amount of space for people that may have fallen victim to many fallacies. He doesn't just kind of point out fallacies and talk about the people that fall for them and laughs and points, as I think is so often the response by intelligent people. They feel like they need to prove their intelligence over others. I didn't really ever get that feeling from this book. I think there is so much more that I could say about this book, but I've been rambling on about it for so long already. Great book. Definitely recommend it. And the next book that I recently read is What the Eyes Don't See. And this book is a kind of memoir, sort of, from Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. And this is about the Flint water crisis. And I really, really enjoyed this book. I gave this a 5-star review on Goodreads. If this wasn't obvious, I gave The Demon Haunted World 5 stars as well on Goodreads. But I have kind of a, public health, community development background. And so I felt like this was a really powerful story. Great story of like the importance of public health workers listening and being part of the communities that they work in. And it really laid out the Flint water crisis, how it came to be, and the very difficult steps that it took to see any sort of action. And I think that some of the criticism around this book was that the author, Dr. Mona, ties in some of her own personal family experience with the crisis as she was kind of dealing with it. I personally really enjoyed that aspect because I thought it was really fascinating to see a lot of the connections and why she was so like interested in moving forward in different ways, and I thought that it was a really powerful story. And I found that this was one of those books that I was really looking forward to like reading the next chapter, and so it was really easy for me to read. I think there were, bits of public health lingo or medical lingo here or there, but she does a really phenomenal job of explaining it or making it quite, simple to understand. So I don't think that this is an inaccessible book if you don't have a public health or a medical background. I think that most people would be able to read this just fine. And I think, in the aftermath of Flint now, while there have been some legislative strides that have happened towards, largely legislation around replacing old lead pipes, I think it's still a little bit disheartening to see that not a whole lot more has really happened, and to think about the EPA's action level for lead in water, the parts per billion in water, which is like the level of lead allowable in the water before action must be taken to address it by authorities. That is not a safety level, but instead it's a level that was kind of agreed upon based on the feasibility of regulations and costs, not health impacts. And coming from a public health background, I know it is more costly to treat disease and to deal with its impacts afterwards, even economically, than to spend the money to prevent it ahead of time. No amount of lead is safe. And that is something that she reflects throughout this book consistently, like that frustration that so many of these policies were created for ease of convenience rather than health, and that a lot of the people that are suffering from those consequences will be suffering for the rest of their life. Lead is not something that you can have a little bit of it and be fine. It is something that will impact you, especially the younger that you are. And a lot of the Flint residents that saw most of the negative impacts were young children in developing stages that relied on, water-based formula, or like pregnant women. And it's just such a sad story, but I did feel like a sense of hope as I kind of read it, of thinking about like there are people doing this work that are phenomenal at it and that truly care about the communities that they are working in. Really interesting story, really enjoyed it. Again, I think it was a little bit more relevant to me with my public health background. The last book I'm going to talk about that I recently read is a science fiction classic. This is Isaac Asimov's Foundation. Oh my gosh, this was a really, really good book. Again, I mean, it's a classic for a reason. and I had not read it before. And side note, I really don't like when books have these like permanently like on book covers. Like, that's not a sticker, like that's on the book cover. Oh well. Or when they're like, you know, soon to be a major motion picture or something like that. I don't like that. But this was, you know, classic sci-fi, great story with so many twists and turns and so many ruses. I don't know if any of you have seen the British comedy show IT Crowd. My family watched it all the time, and then I got my husband to watch it when we first got together. And we quote, there's an episode with a quote in there, and it's like, this ruse has also been a ruse. And I had a few moments like this in the book where you think something, and then you learn like the way you thought about something is like completely different, and they like pulled one over on the reader, but also everyone else. Like, it was just so fun to read for that reason. And I thought, you know, there were some really interesting characters in here, but also some kind of flat characters. I gave this a 4-star rating on Goodreads. I really liked it. You know, that's an 8 out of 10, so it's still a good rating, but I did feel like some of the characters or some of the bits of dialogue kind of fell a little flat for me. I felt like this is a very like political sci-fi book, you know. There's not like tons of action going on all the time. Like, it is quite like dialogue heavy, which I did enjoy. But something that it was a glaring misstep for me is that there are no major female characters in this book. And for some stories, that could be a really valid choice. I don't think there always have to be like a perfect even mix of like male and female characters. But for a story like this is a story that spans centuries. And it takes place, you know, after millennia of human expansion across the galaxy. I find it a little bit hard to believe that humans have somehow expanded that far, cooperated together to be able to do that long enough, and that no women would have had any major interesting part to play in that at all. And I think it kind of like contributes to the idea that male writers often struggle with writing female characters. But I also kind of recognize this book was published, I think, in the early 50s. I think it was 1951, something like that. So I do think it's a little bit of a product of its time here, because I think for a lot of people, the idea of women as scientists or predominant political figures was kind of quite novel to many people still. So I give it a little bit of grace for that, but my husband and I did talk about that quite a bit after I finished this book, because he read this before me and he's already done with the original trilogy, and he's now on to the next one. I think I forget what it's called. There's 3 in the original trilogy, and then he ended up writing a few sequels and I think a prequel like later on. So I did really enjoy this. It's a really fun read for me, and really interesting ideas that I think a lot of modern sci-fi kind of pulls from. So I do definitely recommend this if you have not read it before. So those were the 3 books that I wanted to talk about that I've recently read. Like I said, I've read more, but those were kind of the main ones on the top of my head that I was looking back through my reading notes, and I was like, I think I could probably talk about these ones. And then now I'm going to talk about the books that I've maybe recently picked up in the last few months, or the books that I'm interested in reading next. So I will start with the book that I'm currently reading, and this is the next book in the Foundation series. So I read Foundation I think beginning of March, so I've read a couple of books in between. And then right now I'm reading Foundation and Empire. And I just got, right here in the book, I just got past or into part 2 of this book. So far I do really, enjoy it, and my husband did give me a heads up, hey, there is a stronger female character in this one, so it's something to look forward to. So I think maybe after his first book he might have gotten some feedback on that. I don't know. But I think it's kind of one of those just like funny things when you're reading books from a different time period, and like sometimes it kind of jumps out at you that it was obviously from a different time period. So far I'm really enjoying this one. I am going through it pretty quickly, and I have been trying to kind of stay away from like sharing too much about the stories of these like fiction books, just in case people are like interested in reading them. I don't really want to like spoil anything accidentally. But yeah, another really good book. My husband, like I said, is kind of a bit further into the Foundation series, and we both have really been enjoying talking about it. And I know, as this book also has the little Apple TV logo, there is a new TV show out for Foundation, and I don't know like how strictly it adheres to any of the books or anything, but I really wanted to read at least the original trilogy before watching that if we did end up watching it. So this is what I am currently reading. I love the covers of these books. So this is like the original Foundation. I should have brought up the next one. I think it's Foundation and Empire, and then second Foundation. And we picked up these books on thrift books, and so they are, a little bit banged up. They're used books, but we usually try and find our books in thrift stores or in like antique shops or on thrift books if there's, some books that we're really interested in getting. So this is what I am currently reading. And the next book that I think that I might read after Foundation and Empire is Lord of the Flies. Now this is a book that we picked up at a bookstore when we did a little trip to Roslyn, Washington back in January. I had a little picture in my little vlog video about some of the books we picked up, and so this was one of those books. I have never read Lord of the Flies before. I obviously know quite a bit about the story just because it's like so ingrained into pop culture, I think. So I do know a good bit about it. But I think a lot of people read this in school, maybe, and I just for some reason never had to. So it just kind of was one of those classics that I just never really ended up reading. I know that this is kind of, I think, an easier read, not by the story, but like by the writing. Like it's a bit of an easier read, so I expect that I'll probably go through this pretty quick. But obviously quite a dark, like harder story. But I think this will probably be my next one that I read. And then after this, I might take a break. I usually try and do maybe one or two kind of more serious books, and then maybe something a little bit lighter. Or sometimes I intersperse Stephen King because I really enjoy Stephen King. And speaking of Stephen King, the next book that we had picked up at a thrift store recently is The Shining. And I've read many Stephen King books, but this is one of his classics that I have not read yet. And anytime we go in a thrift store, I'm always taking a look at the book section to try and find other Stephen King books. And so I was very excited to see this one. And I've obviously seen the movie. Phenomenal movie, right? And I also, another classic from Stephen King that I've never read is It. And I have not found that one yet while I've been looking, and I've been holding off on buying it from thrift books because I have so many other books that I can read that I feel like my philosophy for Stephen King so far has been like, ideally I want to kind of wait and try and find it in stores and get it used. But I have gotten a few of his books on thrift books. I think in one of my thrift book hauls. I think I got The Long Walk on thrift books. But yes, I think this will be my next Stephen King book because it's the only one that I have so far that I haven't read. And I'm always on the lookout for other ones. Really interesting, kind of very minimalistic cover here. But I am very excited for this one. And then I have one more book to show you that we recently got. And this is I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. This has kind of been like an Isaac Asimov haul. But we've kind of fallen into an Isaac Asimov rabbit hole a little bit after reading Foundation. And my husband has ordered the full Foundation series and everything. So this one I wanted to get because this has actually been on my want to read list for quite a while. And so when we found it, I was quite excited. It is, a little damaged again, around the edges and stuff, but overall it's a book. I'm usually not too picky about the state of my books. And this is, I think, another science fiction classic that also had a movie made out of it. And I have no idea how closely the movie, adheres to the book. I have no idea, but I have seen the movie. It's been forever, but it's a movie with Will Smith. And I think that this one is also generally quite highly rated. So I think I'm really looking forward to this one. I'm debating on if I want to try and read this one after I finish the Foundation original trilogy, or if I read this one before I get into Second Foundation. But then that has a few books in front of Second Foundation, so I don't know. But either way, I was excited to pick this up. Alright, well, those were all of the books that I kind of wanted to talk to you about. I think kind of some quite serious, heavier topics, and lots of sci-fi, which is kind of interesting because I haven't always been a big sci-fi reader, but I have been really, really excited to get back into reading these last couple of years, and my husband has also really gotten back into it. I would say this year, starting this year, he's really gotten back into it, and he's really enjoying it. So we've now kind of started implementing something where after 9 p.m. we can't watch TV or anything, and we either just sit and talk, or we can play a game, or oftentimes we'll just read. And I feel like that has been really good. It's also just a really good way to wind down and try and get off of our phones too. I hope that you enjoyed seeing some of the books that I've recently picked up and hearing about some of the books I've recently read. I do think at some point it'd be kind of fun to do a little bookshelf tour, but I think a lot of it would be books that you've already seen in videos. But we have really been trying to make an effort to get physical books this last year because I grew up with so many books in my household, and it's just such a special thing to be able to just have bookshelves of books that you can read. And our local library is unfortunately a little bit limited. I think it definitely is more for young teens and young kids. There's very small sections outside of that. So, unfortunately we really can't support our library by reading books that we would want to read. So we've really been trying to pick up books that seem interesting to us as we're out thrift shopping. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that